Hi, welcome to Handcrafted. On today's show, I'm going to make one of these round wall shelves. So let's get started. The round wall shelf is fairly large, so for this project I'm going to use pine. It's economical and lightweight. The idea for this project came from this picture here in a catalog. Now my version won't have these drawers here because they really won't get used, and I'll be able to have more shelf space. Now I was marking my board here down to lengths of roughly 23 inches so that I can glue them up and cut the circle for the rings here, which will be a final dimension of 22 inches. I've cut 4 boards to a rough dimension of 23 inches. I will now joint the edges so that I can glue them up. I'm using 1x12 lumber. That way I can just use 2 pieces to get my overall dimension of 22 inches. Now I just need to glue these up. When gluing up boards, you want to make sure you have glue covering the edges completely. The boards have dried and I'm removing them from the clamps. Now you might think I'd be concerned about the boards warping since I'm using such wide boards, but with this vertical piece here and the shelving, that will minimize any tendency for the boards to warp. Now the next step is to cut the outer circle for the wall shelf, and I'll do that at the bandsaw. Here at the bandsaw, I've clamped this circle cutting jig that I made for cutting large circles, and I've positioned a pin here 11 inches from the blade so that I can then slip my workpiece over the pin using this pilot hole that I drilled 11 inches from the edge. I'll just slip this over the pin and start this cut. To cut the inner circle of the ring, I'll use the router table. And so I made a circle cutting jig for it, and I've got a 1/4 inch straight cutting bit set up in the router. And I have a pin here that is 10 inches from the router bit. And I drilled a hole here 1 inch from the edge of the circle that I will slip over the router bit. And I will use the existing center pilot hole that will slip over the pin here. And so I'll just slip this over the router bit like so. Now I'm going to make this cut. It's a good idea to use hearing protection when using a router. I already sanded the outside of the rings using a palm sander. To sand the inside of the rings, I use a spindle sander, and you will want to use the largest size sanding sleeve you have available. To create the shelving pieces for my wall shelf, I'm going to resaw 3/4 inch pine in half to create thinner material. The stock I'm using here is 5.5 inches. After that, I will plane them down. Using the planer, I will plane these boards down to about 1/4 inch thickness. The two centerpieces of the wall shelf fit together like a cross, so I'm going to cut a notch here in the center so that they can fit together. Next, I'm going to cut these notches on the corners that will support the outside of the rings. Now what I need to do is cut some dados an 1/8 inch deep and 1/4 inch wide on my vertical piece that will accept the shelves for the wall shelf. Now my first shelf will be 6 inches from the center and one on opposing sides, and another one will be 7 inches from the center on opposing sides, and you'll see what that looks like when it starts to come together. Now that I got the dados cut in the vertical piece, I can start to assemble the two pieces to form the cross members. I'm going to use these angle braces to clamp on here and make sure everything stays square. The cross pieces have finished drying, and I'll just test fitting it here in one of the rings. Now the next step I need to do is start marking the length of the shelves that I need. And I'll do that first by sliding it into one of the dados here so that I can mark the length of the shelf. And I'll mark it slightly longer so that I can sand it to a final length. I will now cut all my shelves to length. After cutting all my shelves to length, the next thing I need to do is mark this angle here where the shelf meets the inside of the ring. And that's so I can cut a notch out and the shelf will sit over the ring. I'll do this on both sides and repeat that for all the shelves. To cut these notches on the shelves, I'll first use the bandsaw to make these straight cuts. To cut these angle cuts here, I'll do that by hand using a coping saw. I will now finish up these notches by cutting this angle with a coping saw. I got all the notches cut on the shelves, and now I'm just test fitting everything together. I also sanded the edges of the shelves here using a belt sander to match the diameter of the rings. I will begin gluing the wall shelf up by first gluing the cross piece to the front ring. After it sets up, I will glue the back ring. I will now glue the back ring on. Now I'm ready to glue the shelves onto the wall shelf. And there you have it. The shelves have dried, and I just need to do a little touch-up sanding, and the wall shelf will be ready for staying. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Handcrafted by Lance Mitchell.